Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. A huge welcome from all of us here at Specialized Asia. My name is Gino, and we are broadcasting live from Singapore to bring you AERO is Everything. This is our first live talk session to answer anything and everything that you want to know about AERO. So get comfortable and get your questions ready, all right? Now, for tonight, we have a special guest. This man is an original member of the crew that made the famous specialized wind tunnel at our headquarters in California, and somebody who might be familiar to those of you in China, Taiwan, Japan, and even Korea for his cycling achievements. Without further ado, let's welcome our very own specialized product manager and professional cyclist, Cameron Piper. Hi, Cam, are you there? Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Gino. Really appreciate you having me here, and very excited to get to speak to you all about aerodynamics and some different experiences I've had across your region.
Yeah, thanks so much for waking up early. I know it's, is it 5 a.m. there now?
It is 5 a.m. It's still dark outside, but you know, had some coffee, so we're ready to go.
Perfect, yeah. Just before the training starts, yeah? Yeah, no, so probably it'll be good to kind of kick things off slowly just by maybe a quick introduction for our guests. First, I think let's welcome our viewers from across the region, right? So just so you know, we've got guests viewing in from Singapore, from Malaysia, from the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and even China. Right, so you've got all of Asia really watching this this webcast tonight. Yeah, so it's a good chance for them to kind of come on and ask their questions, right? So what we'll be doing for all of you watching tonight is that we'll be asking you to put in your questions in the chat, right? So for those in the webinar, you can go straight into the chat and put your questions in there, and we'll take those on as we go through the talk with Cam. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, you can put your notes in the comments, and our team from Asia is on standby to pick up all your questions and make sure that those get through to me and Cam, so we can answer all of them as much as we can within the time we have. Sounds good?
Perfect.
All right, okay, let's go. So Cam, maybe we start off the evening just by giving a basic understanding of what aerodynamics is and why do we say AERO is everything at Specialized?
Yeah, so aerodynamics at Specialized has been part of our brand's DNA since we really started. If you look back into the early products of the brand, there's a lot that's really been brought through the generations that show this kind of fascination with aerodynamics. But if you look back in the last 5 or 6 years is when we really started to understand that every aspect of aerodynamics is important for the rider. And Mark Cody, who has been with the brand now for a number of years and was one of the people who really pushed for the wind tunnel, at one time said, AERO is everything. And it was something that really stuck because it made plenty of sense for when we were trying to make this wind tunnel and really capture the important technical aspects of having aerodynamics involved in the development of all of our products to provide a meaningful benefit for our riders.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. You know, I mean, AERO is something that I think a lot of brands in the cycling business have been trying to put into the technology of all their bikes, right? And I think we're not the only ones there. So I think it's quite important to, I guess, explain or share with the viewers out there tonight, you know, why is the Specialized brand of aerodynamics better or different, and what kind of advantage are we able to deliver to our riders on their bikes in general, right? So I think we will go through all those details tonight, right? And we've got a whole set of information and content to share with all of you, right? So that we can help you understand it better, and hopefully all of this translates into better decisions for you, and at the end of the day, for you to go faster, right? So, yeah. So Cam, so what do you think, what would you say about our design philosophy at Specialized, and how does that kind of impact or change the way that viewers should be thinking about Specialized in general?
Yeah, I think before we jump into design philosophy, I think we should really go back to what aerodynamics actually means and how that builds into the equation for someone who's riding. So if we can go to the next slide, there's a quick explanation of exactly what aerodynamics means and what we do to design around those philosophies. So when we think about aerodynamics, it's one of the kind of most tangible things that we have to overcome out on the bicycle, especially when we're riding outside. It's the force that's resisting us as we're moving through the air. So there's a lot we can do with our own bodies to maybe put out more power, but it's important to understand how we can be more effective or efficient with that power that we're putting out. And one of those things that we can do is reduce the overall aerodynamic drag of the system. So the rider plus the equipment that we're actually using. And aerodynamics itself is the biggest factor of that is the overall CDA. So that's what we're measuring within the wind tunnel. And that CDA shown here on this equation, the PD on the left side is the force or the effort that you actually have to overcome in order to overcome that aerodynamic drag. So it's the power you're outputting. The rest of this equation, the second piece, is the air density, so it changes all around the world. So those are two things that we want to remain constant. We don't necessarily want to have to put out more power to go faster. So what can we change? We do want to go faster, so let's increase that speed. So the only thing that we can decrease is the overall CDA, or that aerodynamic efficiency of your body. So that's considered as the shape of the system. So whether it's the shape of a tube shape, your helmet, or let's say some of the materials that's on your body, and then the overall frontal area. And again, that's part of your bike fit. And those are the two factors that we can play with when we're actually designing equipment in the wind tunnel. So that means that if we lower your CDA, you don't have to necessarily go as hard to go the same speed, or if you're still putting out that same effort, you're going to go a little bit faster. And that's something that we can think about in pretty much every situation that we are in out on the road. So there's one more slide here that just kind of better illustrates exactly what we're speaking to when it comes to that shape piece. And if we look at these two different shapes on the screen right now, the top shape is a round cylinder. That's probably one of the least aerodynamic shapes that we can have on a bicycle. But the lower shape, which is, as you can see, it has a much larger frontal area, but in a much longer shape itself, but it's more aerodynamically optimized, which means that even though those two shapes are drastically different, they both have the same exact drag, which is a really important piece of designing a bicycle, because playing around with those shapes and finding the most aerodynamically efficient shapes, you can then change a lot of different pieces of the overall equation. So that's what we really take to heart when we're actually testing the tunnel and we're optimizing around those different shapes, as we've seen with the new shape of speed, for example.
Well, that's really interesting, Cam, because this visual that you're sharing now kind of suggests that even, let's say, or is it correct to say that a brake cable that's hanging out there from your setup in the cockpit could actually have or cause the same drag as your helmet or other parts of the bike? Is that right?
Absolutely. So if you look at a lot of our bikes these days, we're really working to minimize those bad shapes. So something like a cylinder or a brake line. And you can see here with our design philosophy as it's progressed through the years, these are the different tube shapings for Avenge, for example. So in generation 1, we took a lot of guesses when it came to those aerodynamic shapes, more or less playing off airplane wings or things in the past that have shown us what has been fast. And as we slowly learned about the entire frame and exactly how we can optimize around building around those shapes, we worked all the way to the new shape of speed in generation 3 with the most recent Venge, which has now seen a bike that is not only the fastest bike in the world, but also one of the best riding bikes and one of the lightest bikes in the peloton, and still gives you that same aerodynamic efficiency.
These shapes are really interesting because you can see from Gen 1 that I would say that the shape is much longer, right? So I think over time it's kind of gotten shorter and shorter. And I guess it's worth asking, what does that do to the overall aerodynamic performance of the tubes or the shapes? Because they're much smaller now, but does that mean you lose any kind of aerodynamic gains by shortening the tail?
Not at all. So what we do with the new shape of speed, it's a computer simulation where we're fine-tuning the final curves of the actual shape itself. And what that's doing is it's testing a bunch of different iterations of those curves to make sure they don't lose that aerodynamic efficiency, but at the same time, we're managing the overall surface area of the shape, which helps to decrease the weight. And at the same time, we know that that shape is structurally sufficient for a specific area on the bike. And it means there's no extra material or no extra structure that's basically going to negative affect the overall experience you have on the bike. Whereas now we can say, hey, this tube shape doesn't need as much aerodynamic efficiency because it's not actually contributing that much to the overall equation. So we can focus more on the weight and the ride quality, giving the rider a better experience overall versus using the same shapes across the entire frame.
Yes, that's great. And I think surely, these shapes also have an impact on other variables of the bike, right? Like, are there any losses in stiffness or in what you're able to build into the design of the bike? Is there anything that we give up in that respect?
Absolutely. And that's why we're better understanding the entire system as a whole. And some of those things is before you just use a similar shape across the entire frame because you knew it was maybe a well-optimized low CD shape. But now we can say, hey, because the down tube, for example, does not contribute as much aerodynamics as we typically thought, we can change the shape slightly just so that there's less weight involved, but then still giving you the same stiffness that you'd experience for that frame in any turning or riding situation, and gives that rider the best possible benefit.
That's cool. That's really awesome. I'm sure all of this has been tested, of course, in the wind tunnel, right? So I'm sure all the data is available out there, right? At least within our walls. So I think, later on, hopefully, you can share a little bit more on what really goes on inside those walls, right? I think a lot of the viewers tonight are kind of curious, how do you do it? Who's been in there, right? What kind of things, crazy things do you do in there? So we will get to that, right? But I think the first question I would ask is probably on testing, right? Because again, we're not the only brand of bikes that has aerodynamic technology, right? But I'd like to say that we do the best at that. So I'd like to probably hear from you on our testing protocol, like how widely do we use our testing in our aerodynamic work, and what kind of products have we tested in the wind tunnel?
Yeah, absolutely. So the person you just saw on that previous slide, that was Chris Yu. He worked along with Mark Cody to get this wind tunnel up and running when we first started. And I think it goes to show the fascination and obsession we have with aerodynamics. And also it's part of the brand's DNA to always continue to innovate or die. We're looking for all those possible small things that we can do to help a rider no matter what the situation might be. And one of the big benefits of having our own in-house wind tunnel facility is that previously we would be flying really across the country or maybe even outside of the country in the US to go find a tunnel to actually test in. And typically those tunnels were designed for automotive or aerospace, not necessarily around the speeds that we actually cycle as human beings. So it was very important to have that facility that was tuned to us as humans and what makes us the human-powered motor on top of a bicycle. And the side benefit of having our own facility is that we can run for 24 hours a day if we wanted to. And that time is very precious, but for us, because we have this facility open and available for us at all times, we can put really whatever we want in the tunnel, whether that's, obviously our top performing bicycles, but at the same time, smaller things like a fender or even a light or a mount or something that even if there's maybe what doesn't seem like a simple solution to provide some sort of benefit, we might be able to find some way of reducing some noise or something from that product that then gives that rider a significant benefit.
Well, what do you think has been the most memorable? Sounds like you've done a lot in that tunnel, right? What's been most memorable for you in testing?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, Gino, because we've done so much in the last number of years. But some of the more interesting things from my perspective was when we look back at the development of the Tarmac SL6, for example. We took an old frame and we spent a couple weeks just cutting parts of it off, using clay, using different pieces to then say, hey, what makes the most sense that we can optimize on this frame that will not affect the performance of the bike? Or even more recently, the all-new Shiv Tri, the Shiv disc, that bike we took from the ground up, and we literally built more or less airplane wings out of balsa wood for a number of weeks to say, if we added this much surface area onto the frame, how that impacts the crosswind performance of that product, for example, where it's extremely important that those bikes almost essentially sail or have almost zero drag or propel the rider forward just from being in the wind. So we spent a long time, really tinkering and building these airfoils to determine exactly what kind of efficiency we could get out of that specific bicycle before we went into more 3D and CAD-based simulation. So that was a pretty fun product.
Wow. Did I understand that correctly? So on the new Shiv Tri, you said that the thinking was that it should act like a sail. So when you said that, does that mean that if the wind hits you, it can actually, push you forward? But then how does that keep you from falling down on the side, depending on where it's coming from?
It's a balance, but yes, that's more or less what's happening when you have a bike that performs really well in crosswinds. There's a forward component of the drag that's being applied on the bike itself. So if you balance the response that you get from the wind in the shape that you have, as well as the amount of surface area that you have, you're more or less able to use that and harness it so that you're moving forward with that drag. That's why things like disc wheels for those kind of races are relatively important, because they offer so much more surface area to help propel the rider forward.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Yeah. I remember when we saw each other in Kona last year, right? I think that's where you could really feel what the Shiv Tri bike really does for you, because the winds were just coming from all over the place. Left, right, back, front, you name it. It was going around in circles. And I can remember we practically were like planted on the ground so well, and yet we were still going really fast, and just no disturbance from the wind whatsoever. And it felt really comfortable.
It's a pretty magical feeling when you design something that does perform in that way, and it's balanced from front to rear. So we want to make sure that we're not affecting the stability or the confidence of the rider, but still giving them the performance that they need or might expect from an aerodynamic product. So, and even for Kona as well, where you're not actually allowed to race a disc wheel because it's so windy from the coast, creating a frame that has a little bit of extra surface area in those situations that's designed properly does really provide that rider a pretty significant advantage.
Nice. So can you tell me, like how many pros or how many celebrities have you tested in the tunnel, right? Like who are the most memorable ones for you in your experience?
Yeah, we've worked with so many people across all different categories of cycling. And as you can see here, we've even worked with Loic Bruni, for example, in the tunnel on a demo downhill bike, because those guys, even though they don't pedal very often or they don't necessarily have aerodynamics in the forefront in their mind, those races are determined by fractions of a second. So if we can find just the smallest thing that when they're ripping down the hill at 80, 90 kilometers an hour, that gives them that fraction of a second without them having to change anything, that's a pretty big advantage. So we spent a lot of time with those guys in the tunnel, or everyone from triathletes, or this man right here, Peter Sagan. That was a memorable experience from my end back when he first signed with Tinkoff. That was at this point now almost 6 years ago, and he was just coming up. He had already had plenty of wins to his name and was young and hungry, and it was amazing to work with such an athlete of that caliber, and then to see how far he's gone in cycling. And we've seen a number of athletes that have gone through that same progression just from the tools that we've been able to provide them and the resources that they have from our in-house facilities and with the teams that they're working on.
Well, I could barely recognize Peter here.
It's funny how things can change over a number of years, but the same thing goes with the equipment and how that evolves. But a couple other names on here with Marcel Kittel or Javier Gomez and Gwen Jorgensen, Olympic champions. We really get to work with the best athletes in the world and learn a lot from them. It's not just us helping to teach them something new about aerodynamics. We learn a lot about what they want out of their equipment or what they feel like is the best possible advantage for them. And truly, as a brand, a lot of our product is made in racing. We work with the world's best athletes to then take their knowledge and their experience to then better our own products, which ultimately helps everyone. And even guys like Julian Alaphilippe here in the Tour on the new Shiv TT disc, when we got to watch that race as the bike was more or less being launched at that time, and Julian was in the yellow jersey, and we were actually all in a company meeting just as this time trial was finishing up, and they paused the meeting for about 10 minutes just to let this finish. And it was something to watch a product that you'd spent so much time on winning at the world's top stage, more or less, of the Tour de France, knowing that you had a small piece to play in developing that.
That's fantastic. It's really amazing to see how these top athletes really perform so strong, on the field with our bikes. And I was curious to understand, like you mentioned earlier, that the made in racing goes both ways, right? You said that it's not just us teaching the athletes about our theory or our practice on aerodynamics and how it can help them, but you said that they also give back on their inputs. Like, how much of what we develop actually has come back from the athletes themselves, and what kind of inputs are they giving us that helps us develop an even better product or a better performing equipment for their use?
Yeah, so throughout the whole design process of really any piece of performance racing product, there's a lot of back and forth with our top athletes, whether it's triathletes, our World Tour cyclists, you name it. I've spent a lot of years working on these relationships that have helped to build a mutual connection in the development of all this product. So from the concept phase, before we even have any sort of physical product, through the prototype phase, when we have actual frames or prototype helmets or shoes, we work hand in hand with these athletes to say, if we have these two different possible pieces of equipment, here's A and B, let's ride them both. Let's see what makes the most sense and take that feedback and move forward. And that's a big advantage for us to be able to do that.
That's cool. I can see the Shiv TT is right behind you, right?
This was actually, in talking about that, this was one of the first field test frames that we had as this project was progressing. So for me, it's one of my favorite bikes in the garage, I'm not going to lie. And knowing that it was one of those early pieces of the project makes it even more exciting to get to race at all times.
So is this the fastest bike that we have now?
It depends on the situation that you're in. All things considered, it's the bike that will average the fastest speed in the races that it actually races in. That's for sure. Wow. But aerodynamically speaking, it is the fastest bike that we have.
There's a lot of things that came up, I would say, differently with that bike from the previous iteration of the Shiv TT, right? I think the one that caught a lot of people's attention was that big cutaway down on the seat tube, right? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what, why did that happen and what was the thinking around that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the design philosophy that we have with regards to really understanding the entire frame and not just focusing on one specific tube shape or saying that this tube shape works everywhere. When we were optimizing and when we set out the project goals, we really wanted to not only put a more consistent braking platform with disc brakes on the bike, but at the same time, we wanted to reduce the weight and then ensure that those aerodynamics from the original Shift GT did not change. So we tested a lot in the tunnel for this bike. We created SLAs, or big plastic frames that were catted up and created, and then chopped them up and took out different pieces. And a big thing that we realized was that there's an area in the rear of the seat tube here that we could do something fun with. We maximized the UCI box in order to lower the stays to a point where there was basically no drag from the system there. And then we had this small area that we were unsure of if it was really contributing much to the overall performance of the bike when it comes to aerodynamics, because we have the fastest wheel sitting right behind that tube in the Roval 321 disc. So we played around that shape. We made it deeper. We cut it away to almost nothing, and we realized that this is one section of the frame where it wasn't contributing much to the overall air performance, whereas it could probably contribute more to the overall ride performance, or feedback from the rider's input into the BB or in the cranks, as well as reducing a little bit more of that weight that we're hoping to lose from the frame itself. So it turned out to be a very strikingly different feature than we initially kind of expected, because so many of us are used to seeing a tucked in wheel, but the reality is, with the optimization of the disc in any wheel shape that sits behind the seat tube, there was no real need to have that small section of frame there. So we looked back at the new shape speed, found a better tube shape that optimized around the ride quality and the weight, and didn't see a change in air performance. So we moved forward with it.
Well, what we achieved with that bike was really amazing with that weight, right? Huge difference from the previous iteration.
Yeah, this bike built up behind me right now is 7 kilos. So for a time trial bike to be that light is pretty amazing. And one of my personal goals was that sometimes in time trials, you see athletes getting off their bike and getting onto a road bike because it's lighter. And I don't like to see that, because you lose time. So with the bike that's virtually the same weight as what you might have for an aerodynamic road race frame, there's no reason to do that anymore. And you can save those precious seconds and really take this bike on any course, no matter what the parcours or profile might be.
Well, I'm convinced. You can see behind me, I've got my own. So I love riding it. This is a fantastic bike. Yeah.
Awesome.
At this point, maybe we call on the team, right, to check if there's any questions that they would like to have us answer. Maybe I call on Khalif in Malaysia, right? Khalif, are you there?
Hello there.
Yeah, hi Khalif. Yeah.
Hey. Okay, great. So yeah, we have one guy asking at which point where the aerodynamic will take effect significantly, meaning that at what speed that will take effect. Thank you.
Yeah, so aerodynamics, no matter what speed you're moving, is providing some sort of resistance to your body. Even if you're walking outside, there's still an effect that you're overcoming. So the reality is, that's why the AERO is everything mantra is still there, is because virtually in any situation, you're going to see some sort of benefit from an aerodynamic improvement. The question that always comes up is, but really, what is the trade-off between maybe aerodynamics and weight? And that's where you see the biggest difference in terms of when aerodynamics might not be the largest contributor to the overall drag or resistance that you're overcoming. And it's not necessarily the speed at which you're moving It's more the gradient of the road, or which would actually cause you to slow down a bit. So we typically see that aerodynamic benefits are still a benefit really at any grade up to, let's say, maybe 9 or 10%, where your speed will significantly drop below 15, 16 kilometers an hour, to which the weight becomes a larger factor in the overall performance benefit from that perspective. So the other thing here to think about too is that if you're moving at slightly lower speeds out on a course, you're actually going to see a bigger advantage from aerodynamic improvements because of the fact that you're out on the course for a little bit longer. So when we talk about time saved over 40 kilometers, someone who's riding, let's say 20 kilometers an hour, it's going to take them 2 hours to finish that course. Whereas maybe the fastest people might finish in 40 kilometers an hour, it's an hour. So the person who's out there for 2 hours, because they're out there for a little bit longer, the time that they can actually save from an aerodynamic benefit is greater than the person who is out there for maybe only an hour. The difference isn't that much different, but because you're out there for longer, you're saving that same energy for a little bit more. So maybe you save 100 extra kilocalories or something. So there's no real speed at which aerodynamics is no longer an important part of the equation. It's more of when the weight becomes the trade-off. So aero is a benefit for everyone, no matter what speed you're moving at.
Well, that's really interesting, Cam, because you said the aero, right, is only trumped by weight when you hit, what, 9% gradients? Is that right? Wow, that's, I mean, at least in Singapore, well, we don't have 9% gradients down here, so surely aero is going to be the most important factor, right? With long, smooth, flat roads. And in many other countries, I think you'd have to travel quite a long way to get to the mountains that will give you those gradients, right?
Yeah, typically when it comes to those scenarios too, is having the tunnel, we get to test in different positions. So for a rider to say, hey, I'm in my extensions, and I also know the aerodynamic drag of when I'm in my base bar, it helps to say, hey, when you're on a climb, you really should stay in your extensions up until a point when you feel like it's too steep, or you can put out a little bit more power in your base bar because of that position, or it's a moment to kind of relax. So even though the base bar position might be 30 watts slower, even at climbing speeds, if you can put out 30 more watts in that position and you're more comfortable for a climb, then that's where the trade-off might make more sense too. So there's a lot of kind of different factors when it comes to making those decisions.
Ah, interesting stuff. Maybe we try to call on Japan. We have Naoki on standby. We appreciate that the Japanese riders have been invited to this talk, and we appreciate that there's a language barrier. But I see that there's a lot of people out there who are still willing to hear from us, and the team in Japan has been really gracious to kind of translate on our behalf anything and everything that we've been talking about. So just to check, Naoki, are you there? Is there any question that the Japanese riders are keen to hear from us on?
Hi, Gino. Thank you very much. And good morning, Cam. And we have two questions coming up. And the one is, now we know the wind tunnel testing, the detail, but what the process before the wind tunnel? So second question is, in the triathlon world, there are the unique shape. For example, the other competitor bike makers. How the difference between our bike and the competitors? So two questions, please.
Okay, yeah, so before we had the wind tunnel, as I mentioned earlier, we would be testing in other facilities around the US that were mostly automotive wind tunnels. So we would have to pack up everything, fly out somewhere, and be testing for only a very strict amount of time because you're paying per hour. So it was a much different scenario versus the time that we have now to really take your time and play around with different combinations or setups. But alternatively, we also do have the ability to test in velodromes. So that's the only other real controlled environment outside of a wind tunnel that allows you to get those really precise numbers that you're looking for. And we still do that with some of our top athletes, just as an alternative for traveling to California. There are scenarios where you could test outside, but the variability in the data is not something that's helpful necessarily for developing product itself because of other factors like a gust of wind or car driving by. So we really do rely on some of these more controlled facilities to get the more precise data in order to make these very small changes that can all add up to a big difference. And then going to your second question about what makes the Shiv disc unique versus some other competitors is when you think about triathlon, you're doing an entire race and you're not just racing on a bicycle, you're also swimming and then you're running after you ride. So there's other factors that are really important for the race itself, which includes carrying everything you need to make sure that you can go out and run a marathon or a half marathon after completing your bike leg. So we spent a lot of time working with not only improving the aerodynamics of the frame, but understanding how we can create different tube shapes that allow you to have internal storage. So whether that's for your SWAT or your tools or your actual food or nutrition, we built in those systems into the frame to allow riders to maintain that maximal aero benefit that they have from the frame while still being able to take in the nutrients that they need or carry the supplies that they do. So from that perspective, we spent a lot of time doing that while still trying to balance a lot of the remainder of the factors that help contribute to the performance of a bike. Whereas with some other brands, for those specific parts, you're strapping on a bottle somewhere on the frame, which means you're going to be a little bit slower, or you're putting a bento box on, or some other different features that not only mean that you have to add some aerodynamic drag potentially, but you're also adding additional weight, whereas our system is all built in and ready to go on race day.
Thanks, Cam. We have a few more questions in the group. Straight from the chat room, we've got Kuhn here asking, how does the test in the wind tunnel translate to real world where winds come from all directions? And how do we actually perform the real world testing? And how does it correlate with our tunnel testing? How is that kind of mimicked, or how is that matched?
Yep, that's a great question. And one important thing to think about is that while we are in a very controlled environment in the wind tunnel, we typically test or develop around the conditions that we'd be expecting to see on the road. So whether that's the speed you're traveling at, or the actual yaw angles, or the way that the wind is hitting you, to ensure that the bike will perform in the real world as you might expect from those scenarios. And lastly, with wheels and the steering torque that you're put on, it's important to balance that as well so you feel confident when you're riding the bike. But to speak to the differences that you'd see in the tunnel versus on the road, the differences are actually very similar because of the delta that we're looking at. So when you're comparing two different products, you're looking to see the difference in the aerodynamic performance of those two products. And one thing that we did, especially with the 5-minute campaign, for example, back when we launched Avenge Vias, was we took the entire suite of products that we're launching there that ultimately add up to 5 minutes of time saved over 40 kilometers versus a traditional setup. And when we were working through that, we actually went through that procedure a number of times with different athletes in the tunnel, so measuring those deltas, and then taking them out onto a course out on the road. So something that wasn't necessarily all flat, it was rolling and it was a loop. So you're seeing wind from all different angles. And the deltas were actually the same. And that's pretty indicative of everything that we've done in terms of testing and what we see when it comes to testing in the tunnel, and then bringing those experiences out onto the road.
Thanks, Cam. Thanks, Cam. Wow, this summary chart that you have shared there just really points out, how much you really gain. I have here my own helmet, right? The Evade, and I'm really curious. Like, it's interesting that the numbers that you showed there. Maybe I hand this over to you. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe tell us about how the development of this helmet actually brought that many seconds into the equation, right? Because I never imagined that a helmet could give that much.
Yeah, this was a fun project as well. This was another one where we really looked at the actual, what was really contributing to the overall drag of the helmet itself. So the shell shape, and as you can see here, this was one of the early prototypes of just specifically the shell itself. So that's what's a large driver for the overall aero performance of the helmet itself. And when you step back and look at it, there's really one primary focus for a helmet to begin with, and that's the safety of the rider. So if we know we need to wear it and we need to be safe, there's a couple other factors that help to make sure that that experience is actually better. And for the Evade 2, the priority for that was to not only slightly improve the aerodynamic performance of the helmet itself, but also how can we use the vents that we have on the helmet, and then the internal channeling to also improve the overall thermodynamics. So the ventilation and the cooling of your head to ensure that you're comfortable and confident with still riding this helmet. And with the Evade 1, we had a really good shell shape that we used, which provided 42 seconds savings over a rail, for example, when riding over 40 kilometers, which is a significant effort savings. Really, that's at 40 kilometers an hour, that's just about 10 watts just from changing your helmet. So by being able to then take the next step with the Evade 2 and focus more on the comfort or the ventilation of the helmet, so that this becomes a helmet that you want to ride in really all conditions, whether it's hot out, whether it's cool out, XYZ, you're saving the aerodynamic benefit over a more traditional ventilated helmet, as well as, something that's lightweight and still very comfortable. So that was a fun project to really understand exactly how airflow moves through a helmet across your head and keeps you cool.
Oh, nice. I'm looking at the chat, and there seems to be a lot of people interested in the Shiv TT. So there's a few more questions on specific to that bike. I told you it's a hot one. Here we have Terrence asking, what happens to the performance of the Shiv TT if he changes the front wheel to a tri-spoke or change the rear disc wheel into a non-disc wheel? And what are the limitations that the UCI had that we kind of I guess worked around on making it faster so that we could see more of these aero bikes climbing and doing better things than the previous iterations?
Yeah, so when it comes to wheel choice, we do have our own in-house wheel brand with Roval, which we've spent a lot of time and resource on to create some of the world's fastest wheels. So we do develop around what we consider to be the fastest wheels, but swapping wheels out and changing them doesn't necessarily drastically affect the performance of the frame itself. So you won't lose any aero performance of the frame. You'll just potentially lose some performance depending on the wheels that you choose, or the weight might change or things like that. So comparatively, if you were to run this Shiv TT frame versus a competitor, for example, with different wheels, you'd still see the same aerodynamic benefit from the Shiv TT disc versus what you might see with the Roval 321 disc wheel itself. This will just be the fastest combination in terms of the wheel choice that you have for this bike specifically. But when you look at what we did with this frame to really maximize or push the boundaries of what the UCI regulations say, the biggest one here is the frame proportions or the frame boxes that you have to live within to make this a UCI approved bike. And some of those requirements are the height of the seat stays here. So with this really extreme kickback, we wanted to make sure that it stayed as low as possible. So basically, as you can see here, there's a regulation for how low the seat stays can be. But then by keeping them straight, you don't add any additional frontal area before they come down to the chain stays. So that was a big maximum improvement from the UCI rules to maximize that. Lastly, the depth of the head tube, and then some other tube proportions that are really just pushing on the outside of those boxes to maximize the overall performance gain that we can get from the rules themselves.
Thanks, Cam. Thank you. Wow, we've got a lot of questions coming our way. Maybe we call on some of our friends in China. I think Vico is on the line. Just to check, is there anything from the side of China that we want to get through to answer? Are you there, Vico? Seems maybe something with the connection. Okay.
Maybe can ask me.
Okay, let me move on while we try to get Vico on the line. Cam, we talked about some of the variables a little bit earlier, and I have some questions here because Frederick has thrown in a question on what have we experimented on, things like paint texture of the bicycle. Matte is the lightest in terms of frame weight savings, so does the paint have any factor into the overall aerodynamic performance of the bike? And I guess the broader question is like, what are some of those variables that can affect your overall speed with the rider and bike in mind altogether?
Yeah, to quickly touch on the paint piece, at the speeds that we travel at, the actual texturing of the frame itself, so whether it's a gloss or a satin finish, does not necessarily affect the overall performance of a frame, for example. Unless we were traveling at well over 100 kilometers an hour or much faster speeds, that's when those textures start to contribute a little bit more than you typically experience for smaller shapes like these. When it comes to the overall equation for a rider plus the bike, that's when a lot of the fit work we've done with Retool Fit to understand how we can improve both the overall aero performance of that system, but also the rider's output when it comes to how much power they can output. So a lot of work that we do in the tunnel is to test various positions within a rider's fit range or their flexibility range to say, okay, in this performance, if we were to try going a little bit lower, does that make that rider actually aerodynamically more faster? Or conversely, if we bring them higher, how does that affect their aero performance? And previously, before having the facility, a lot of times people just thought, just slam the front end and try to get super narrow as possible and just tough it out, like it won't be comfortable, but if you can hold that position, you'll be faster. And we've learned for the majority of cases, actually bringing a rider a little bit higher and giving them some more comfort within their fit range, it actually improves their overall aerodynamic performance as well as their overall power output because they're more comfortable. And then the last really important piece is that because they're more comfortable, they can hold that position for longer, which means that you're more aerodynamic while you're actually out on course, because the moment you sit up in the base bar is you've lost all your aerodynamic benefit from your fit position. So we've spent a lot of time working through that process with all of our athletes to really understand how that fit can affect your aero performance. And it's one of the biggest things that I think a lot of athletes learn is that sometimes it's okay to balance the comfort and power output of your position with that aerodynamic potential. And we've also learned that there's no perfect position that fits or suits everyone. So you have to kind of test and play around to understand for your own personal body and flexibility range, what works the best for you so that you can maintain that position and remain the most aerodynamic within riding extensions.
Wow, I think that's a very interesting point to make, because you're right. A lot of riders think, just slam it down, get it low, and that's the fastest you're going to get your bike to go with you on it. So it's really eye-opening to hear that there's actually that balance that you need to play between your position on the bike and how low you go and how aero you can be against how much power you can put out on it. And I think that's a very, very big difference. And I don't know, would you be able to say who among the pros has kind of done some work around that area, and what kind of changes they made specifically in that respect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes when we look at triathletes, for example, you're out on the bike for 4, 5, 6 hours, and that's when you really need to start thinking about, okay, if I need to hold this position for this long, what makes the most sense for my body to then remain tucked and aerodynamic and efficient? And a lot of our athletes might come into the tunnel and complain about some different issues for when they go out onto the run, because they have tight hamstrings or some of their back issues or something. And, the reality is that it's probably because they were a little bit too aggressive on the bike itself. And that's helped and really made a big difference for a lot of those athletes. But at the same time, if you look at an athlete like Peter Sagan, for example, he's not really a time trial specialist, but his position is actually quite tall, and it's more focused on his power output for being maybe a more explosive rider or someone who could do well in a shorter time trial, versus really trying to get every single small watt out of his aerodynamic position. And then lastly, another rider who's done quite well this past year, Casper Asgreen, who was in the tunnel around this time last year, he focuses very, very well about a lot of these aero performance benefits that he can gain. And he came into the tunnel maybe a little bit too low and found that going higher for him was allowing him to really tuck his head quite a bit lower, which then drove some aero benefit, but also allowed him to put out some more power, and led to him winning his national championship this past year, and has seen some great success in time trial, which is always great to see.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Wow, we still got a lot of questions coming up. Maybe we take a few more and then we try to move on to the next big topic. But Taiwan, yeah, I see some questions coming in. Steve, could you pipe in and share the question with us? Are you there, Steve? Yeah, from Taiwan. Okay, maybe some connection problems there, but let me see. Okay, we have a question. Oh no, we covered this already on the climbing. Okay, so maybe we move on. I think we're coming close to the end of the time, but I think it's important to probably ask, and this is the, I guess, one thing that's on a lot of people's minds, right? So like, what's next, right? So aerodynamics on the bike, right? What's the new frontier? Like, what is the next big thing that we're working on, and where do we see some potential gains or additional gains on top of what we achieved so far?
Yeah, that's always a really good question. I think a lot of us, especially having spent so much time in the tunnel, we really try to focus on what is that next thing that's a benefit for the rider. And a lot of that still comes down to really understanding and identifying the rider's needs. And we create products for the rider based on their input, as well as what we might notice or understand from what they're doing. And a big one recently has been the evolution of the tunnel facility itself. It's no longer just an aerodynamic facility. We also have a human performance lab, so the HPL, which allows us to get a little bit deeper into the metabolics of a rider. So understanding positional efficiency and exactly what drives a rider to be able to output certain power. And from a a tunnel perspective, that's great because we can pair those positional changes with an actual number of understanding that this position or this hand or wrist position can really change a lot for what a rider is doing and what they can output. And that's been a huge driver for a lot of our top end athletes to understand from their perspective what can be that next big thing for them, as well as helping to better inform riders around the world of what the small changes you can make that will positively affect or benefit yourself. And part of that comes down to some thermodynamics work, and especially in apparel and in fabrics, and what we're doing to really improve the speed of athletes out on the bike, and material choice and ventilation and different factors that are outside of just shaping tubes on a frame. And there's a photo here on the screen, which was a fun test that we did, or development, actually, not just one test. It was a number of different sessions with our US Olympic speed skating team to develop a faster speed skating suit. And that was something where we learned a lot about a different sport, and we're able to take some of those learnings and apply them to cycling, which is a big benefit for us, having a wind tunnel that is not meant for automotive. It's meant for human sports. It's something that the speed ranges that we test in are applicable to a number of different sports outside of just cycling, but still allow us to take all those different small bits of knowledge that we get from a different sport and then apply them back to the same sport that we love. So, we're always going to be progressing and trying to make the fastest bikes in the world. And that's shown with Venge and Shift ET and Shift Disc. But, we're never going to stop trying to progress all categories in cycling, whether it's, helmets or materials or whatever else we might be making.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Cam. I think we're running out of time. I guess at this point, I just want to ask, before we close, would you have any tips for our riders and viewers out there on how they can best put themselves or gain from the aerodynamics of what they have, and what are the little things that they can do to improve it, if not get one of the new bikes that we have?
Yeah, there's always that's a big question we get often, and people want to know what they can maybe purchase or what they can do to see that small advantage. And we've spoken about a couple of them, for example, with an Evade versus a Prevail helmet, where you're buying some free speed there just from changing your helmet, or it's better understanding how unzipping your vest and in the middle of a race and letting that flap around can really negatively affect the air performance of your body, or simply even just shaving your legs. That was something that we had tested when we first opened the tunnel, didn't believe it, tore down the entire tunnel balance to make sure everything was calibrated properly, to say, hey, after having a dozen or so other people shave their legs in the tunnel, it's actually a significant advantage for riders, even if it's just a local triathlon, or you're doing the Taiwan KOM challenge, for example, climbing up a hill. There's small things like that can be a pretty big advantage for the rider. But I think ultimately the thing that everything boils down to for me even too is just to really enjoy the process of riding, and maybe geeking out on a couple of those small aerodynamic things, but also just the more you're excited about riding your bike, the more you're enjoying the experience, means that you're going to want to do it more often, become more fit, and just really enjoy the process and love riding bicycles for what they've been created to do. So there's a huge list of things I could say that would improve the aerodynamic system that you're using, but ultimately it comes down to just enjoying the ride.
Thanks, Cam. That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you so much, Cam. I know this is a lot on you. We thank you for your time and spending a good hour explaining all of this to us and our riders in the region. I just want to say to all the viewers, right, thank you so much for listening in. We would like to hear from you, so you'll see a recap of the whole talk tonight on Facebook, so visit our country pages over there. Put in your comments, give us some feedback, and let us know what you want to hear about next time or who you want to hear from, and we'll see what we can do, right? But until then, tune back in and keep close watch on our pages, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you for having me, Gino. And I'm always happy to answer more questions. So I'll follow along on some of your Facebook pages or reach out to me on some different social platforms, and maybe get out for a virtual ride if that happens too on Zwift too. We can all be so connected these days, and I think that's fantastic. So I'm always happy to have a chat and answer any other questions you might have. But really appreciate the time and questions that you guys gave me, and enjoy the ride.
Thanks. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Cam. Bye.
Bye.